Well, good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. For this series, Reverend Chris has asked me to take a new departure. He's asked me to do something called Lockdown with Linda as COVID-19 forces us into further restrictions for a time. So look forward for vaccines. And what Reverend Chris has asked me to do this time is to return to the theme of our history and to take a light-hearted approach, he's asked, to some aspects of our past. And so I've been thinking about how to do this, and the way that I thought of doing it was perhaps to have one of those wonderful historical dinner parties. Because there are some characters from our non-subscribing past that I would really love to have met and to have got together for a dinner party. And so that was the thought I'd had. And a number of people, we're actually sitting now, Ronnie and myself, in our dining room at home. And those of you who know how it would be quite a tight squeeze to get everyone around our dining room table for this party. Just about do it, but we would have to sit with our elbows very closely in while we were eating and be careful not to nudge one another. So I'm going to try time travel to the 19th century. I'm going to imagine myself as a society host, as possibly a member of Second Congregation. You'll know that in the middle of the 19th century, both First and Second Congregation met in Rosemary Street. Second Congregation at the end of the century moved out to Elmwood Avenue and is now known, of course, as All Souls. But I'm thinking about a time in the middle of the 19th century, and I'm going to imagine myself as perhaps a member of a linen household with a large house and a large Victorian dining room lit by candlelight and with lovely linen tableware and with plenty of servants to cook a wonderful dinner and to serve it so that we can all enjoy it together. And the guests at this dinner party, well, we'll have to have a little bit of poetic license here because to a degree these people are not absolutely completely contemporary. The first of my guests is going to be Fletcher Blakely of Money Ray. The second is going to be William Bruce, the elder of First Church. And of course, any historian will know that William Bruce died in the middle of the 1830s, by which time he was blind and he'd gone back to Dublin where he was living with his daughter. But we're going to imagine him within easy travel distance of our other guests. And the other guests at this party are going to be Reverend David McGuinness of York Street in Belfast, which also became part of, which combined with Second Congregation after the Second World War and ultimately combined with the congregation in All Souls. And another very interesting character, a lay person this time, Mr. Robert McCalmont of Mount Pottinger. And these are the people I'm going to imagine getting together for dinner. So in the coming weeks, we'll just spend a short time with each. And of course, you're going to be seeing this through the rather gossipy eyes of a Victorian dinner party hostess. So there'll be, again, a certain amount of poetic license because I would like to share some of my impressions of these characters, and other historians may view them in quite different ways. There's one person that I'm leaving off my dinner party list, but he's someone that I would really like to have met and talked to too. And that's the Reverend John Scott Porter. John Scott Porter was based at First Church in Belfast. And I have two reasons for not including him on my dinner party guest list as a hostess. The first, well, both I suppose in a way are to do with his personality, but the first of these reasons is that he is described, he's been variously described. He's been described as genial and capable of singing a good song, but also as stern and dignified. And it's that stern, dignified character that really emerges largely from the pages. The second reason is a more gossipy one. He had a very bitter, personal and acrimonious dispute with one of the other dinner guests who had been his student. We'll look at the background reasons for this later on, but I think to bring them together for this dinner party would not be a genial experience. I think that John Scott Porter was perhaps more introverted than the others that I want to invite. That's just my impression of him. He leaps from the pages of his writings as someone with a brilliant mind, and he was undoubtedly regarded as a brilliant scholar. He studied Hebrew and Greek and was extremely proficient in those biblical languages. He was a forerunner in the discipline of what's known as textual biblical criticism, seeking a more accurate translation of scripture He was very fond of the King James Version, not to become known as the Authorised Version, but he wanted a more accurate translation. And his abilities in theological dispute are very clear in his writings and in his activities. And sometimes he strikes me as if he is building a castle of wonderfully hewn blocks of beautiful stone that he is carving and dressing and putting together, so that through the windows of this edifice that he's building, the light of a religion of faith based on reason and conscience will shine forth, deeply rooted in a profound understanding of Scripture and in the capacity of bringing personal interpretation to that Scripture. I think he had a very remarkable mind, and I'm not the only person to have thought that. And of course he was a professor, and he taught non-subscribing students who were aspiring to ministry. But there are a couple of things that give us another insight into John Scott Porter's character. We should remember that he was bereaved as a child. He suffered childhood bereavement. His mother died when he was, I think, about 8 years old, and that must have made an impact on him. His father remarried, and he was evidently extremely fond of his aunt, or perhaps step-aunt, Miss Frances Class, and he writes a wonderfully warm obituary for her, and he talks about her as this amazing lady who enjoyed foreign travel and spoke several European languages. And so we can imagine her perhaps encouraging this young boy, this young motherless boy, with his stepmother perhaps devoting her attention more to her own children, which would be perfectly understandable as John Scott Porter grows up. And so we get an impression of his relationship with her and of how she might have encouraged his studies. And the other comes from a record of John Scott Porter, something that he loved, which is really wonderful, I think, about him going to engage a sedan car. And of course, he was based in Rosemary Street, and he talks about the entries opposite the church there. And that's where, among other businesses, sedan chair operators of Belfast worked from. And he talks about going to a party and going to have to go across the road to engage a sedan chair to take his wife to the party. And he describes how she travels, and we can imagine her perhaps wearing a skirt with a great crinoline spread out in her finery in the sedan chair. And he describes himself as trotting along beside her, a devoted husband. And he must have been a devoted and loving husband. And so we'll wave goodbye to John Scott Porter and his wife as they go off to their dinner party, and I'm sure they'll enjoy it. And we'll start to make preparations for ours. So I'll see you next week for dinner on Friday.